Hi everybody, I hope you're all keeping well. We're just going to carry on. We're on chapter 7 and this one is called London, England, Nothing to Declare. Don't speak unless you have to, Mrs. Bancoli warned them. She'd smiled goodbye to the air hostess, but her fleshy cheeks now seemed to stiffen at the corners of her mouth. Mrs. Bancoli lowered her voice despite the clatter of feet and squeaking of luggage wheels along a corridor that seemed to have no end. Sade read Femi's sullen face. Who would they want to speak to anyway? To say what? It was going to be difficult enough talking to Uncle Dele. Sade hoped Uncle Tunde had done all the explaining on the telephone and that he wouldn't ask more questions. How could she ever put the terrible pictures in her head into words? Hi there. Ain't you kids going to freeze? It was the American. The black eyes on his outfit now peeped out from beneath a great black coat that matched a wide-brimmed felt hat. Oh, they'll be fine, Mrs. Bancoli replied quickly. My brother will bring their winter coats to the airport. You know they don't feel the cold like me with my old bones. She laughed lightly and pretended to quiver a little underneath her own mock leopard skin coat. The American glanced curiously at the children. Well, have a good time. Neither Sade nor Femi said anything. He looked a little puzzled. With large strides, however, he was soon well in front of them. At immigration control, everyone came to a halt. Most of the passengers joined a long winding queue underneath a bright yellow sign with the words "Other Passports" in thick black letters. Mrs. Bancoli shepherded the children into another shorter queue marked European Community Passports. It was moving more rapidly. Sade saw the American near the back of the long queue, staring across at them. She shifted her gaze to the desks ahead of them, in each of which perched a figure in a dark suit. Yemi, take this. Addie, come. Mrs. Bancoli thrust her small case into Sade's hand and led them up to the box. Mrs. Bancoli held out her passport. In silence, the eyes behind the desk travelled down to the book, then sideways. Sade could just see the top of the computer. The eyes suddenly flicked back to them, resting briefly on each in turn, as if taking 3 snapshots. Sade's stomach tightened, and for the first time she began to worry about the passport. The eyes were taking much longer than the brass buttons. Everyone else in this queue had gone through so quickly. What would happen if she and Femi were questioned? It wouldn't take long before the truth came out. And then? What if they were put on the next plane going home? The eyes would tell the police in Lagos. Perhaps the police would try to use the children to get to Papa. Femi was fidgeting, stubbing one trainer against the floor. Mrs. Bancoli looked at him sharply. Sade wished she could send a message into his mind of what the eyes could do. He shouldn't draw their attention, but Femi seemed in his own world. One hand on Mrs. Bancoli's case, he swivelled around as if suddenly changing direction with a football. Addie! Mrs. Bancoli's voice carried a lightning warning. Suddenly, the eyes relaxed. Practising for the World Cup, is he? The man said, handing back the passport. Oh, thank you, officer. Mrs. Bancoli's face lit up. Storm avoided. Sade was surprised by her own little leaps of relief. A ramp led down to baggage reclaim. Suitcases, boxes and bags were lunging onto conveyor belts that circled through the large hall. People crowded close, grabbing cases, pulling and pushing trolleys. It wasn't long before the little brown holder was flung out onto the conveyor belt, followed by Mrs. Bancoli's large maroon suitcase. Fastening the buttons on her shiny leopard skin coat, Mrs. Bancoli led the way underneath a green Nothing to Declare sign. Sade pushed the trolley with Femi, dragging his feet beside her. Ahead of them, a small group of men and women stood in white shirts and black trousers beside a row of empty tables. Behind was a large doorway. Was Uncle Dele waiting outside there, scanning all the faces, just like they used to do in Lagos when they went to the airport with Mama and Papa? But these buildings seemed more enormous. What was he waiting? What if he was waiting somewhere else? How would they find him? They were almost by the door when a voice stopped them. Over here, please. A short woman by the tables beckoned them. She had pepper-red lips and a bob of cassava yellow hair. I'd like you to open your cases, madam. Femi stepped closer to Sade, suddenly showing interest. But I have nothing to declare, Mrs. Bancoli said with determination. Sade remembered Black Beret the night before and how Mrs. Bancoli had managed to avoid unpacking everything. I want you to open your cases, please, madam, Pepper Redlips repeated. This time Sade heard her stress the word cases. The lady wanted to check their small brown bag as well. Mrs. Bankole was about to heave the large suitcase onto the table when a man with a face as stiff and as sharp as a rock hurried across to Pepper Redlips. He whispered something in her ear. Please follow us and bring your luggage with you, Pepper Redlips said quietly. Sade saw Mrs. Bankole hesitate for a second. Then, drawing back her shoulders, she raised her head and stretched her neck proudly, a peacock preparing for a fight. She was as short as Pepper Redlips, but her green headdress gave her a couple of extra inches. Why do you ask me this? What's going on here? She demanded, her tone rising boldly. We are custom officers, madam, answered Rockface. Hardly a muscle moved in his face. He kept his voice down. We are empowered to examine your goods. By law you are... Oh, all right, Mrs. Bankole threw up her hands. Do your work, but just hurry up. My husband is waiting for me. Sade and Femi glanced at each other. Mrs. Bankole had said nothing to them about her husband. Rockface unpacked and Pepper Redlips examined. As the stacks of brightly coloured material next to the maroon suitcase grew taller, Sade thought of the stalls in Alade Market. Almost 30 bubbas with matching wraps and headscarves, a small mountain of decorated leather sandals, a mound of carved bracelets and gold bangles. Everything looked new. At least Pepper Redlips worked neatly, not like the swarm of police who tipped out Papa's suitcase when they'd seized his passport. But Pepper Redlips seemed to be looking for something well hidden. When she came to Mrs. Bankole's toilet bag, she smelt and touched the contents of each jar, and suddenly Sade realised what they were after. Of course, drugs. She'd heard Papa and Mama talking about drug smuggling, how poor people could be tempted by the money. Papa had written some articles. Did Mrs. Bankole smuggle drugs as well as children? She didn't look very poor. Whatever would happen to them if Pepper Redlips found anything? Surely Uncle Tunde wouldn't have let them go with Mrs. Bankole if he thought she was a drug smuggler. Nervously, Sade chewed her thumb, watching the officers work in silence while Mrs. Bankole sat with her arms folded grimly. What are you going to do with these? Sell them? The suitcase was